Okay, so today we're going to be talking about journalist Robert Whitaker, probably the most threatening journalist to mainstream psychiatry. And so he wrote Anatomy of an Epidemic. This book probably sent me down the path to where I am today because he called kind of BS on a lot of the things that was happening within the field.
So there's no study they could find that shows medicated people do better than unmedicated groups in the psychotic disorders.
The number one thing that Robert Whitaker put on the map was the idea that taking psychiatric medications long-term could make you worse. And that is what he talks about in Anatomy of an Epidemic. And he details this for every single group of patients with depression, with mood disorders, or with schizophrenia. And so much of the stuff that he says, it makes complete sense, but it flies in the face of what drug companies want you to think about the drugs. So let's look at two different stories. The one story is that major depressive disorder, it's a chronic condition, it's a lifetime illness. You need to get on a medication because it's going to rebalance your serotonin, and this drug will just keep you going despite your biology. So for a long time, that was the idea about psychiatric medications and how they helped. Robert Whitaker comes along and he says something very different. Depression, it's mostly, it's very multifactorial. Maybe there's a genetic component to it, but mostly it's just environmental and life hardship. And maybe it's not a really good idea to put people on medications who are going through normal life stresses. Sure, maybe these things will help in the short term. They will take the edge off the person's emotions, but is it really beneficial to suppress some of those emotions, which really are warning signs towards anxiety and stresses happening in your life? So on the one hand, that may not be the healthiest thing for the person long-term, to just constrict your emotions without helping a broader picture. The other thing that he talks a lot about is the idea of tolerance, that these are drugs just like any other drug. And if you take them, essentially your brain gets used to them over time, and then the effect goes away, and then you feel like your depression is breaking through, that it's really like evolved and it's really resistant to treatment, but really you haven't addressed the problems causing the depression, and now you're just dependent on the medication. You've built up a tolerance and you need to go to higher and higher amounts. He would look at that and say, this is a bad thing that's happening now. This is drugs following just the normal kind of science of tolerance to drugs. But the other mainstream psychiatrists would see, oh my God, the depression is evolving. The other thing that Robert Whitaker talked a lot about was the idea of gateway drugs, how antidepressants could really be gateway drugs to other conditions. Like if you got on one of those, you could have a manic or an agitated type reaction, and then all of a sudden your depression isn't depression anymore. It starts getting misdiagnosed as bipolar disorder. And so when you look at these three different areas, one, that people aren't addressing the underlying causes of the depression and they've been misled to think that they just need to be on meds. Two, that the meds long term, they just kind of cause tolerance and you get a lot of breakthrough symptoms. And three, that they can be gateway drugs into other psychiatric problems. He takes these things together, and his argument is really, hey, these drugs are probably making people worse in the long run. And his whole book, Anatomy of an Epidemic, is about collecting all of the research and all of the data that addresses this point. He looks at the rise in disability from mental health, and I think he makes a really good point. Intuitively, that makes sense to me, and I think it really resonated with a lot of people. Like, if you're coming from a place where you're like me now, at least, where when I look at people who have depression and I say, hey, the majority of this is due to hardship, and maybe there's like 1 in 20 where it's just like, hey, what's going on with this person? From the day they were born, they were pretty depressive, and they've had a lot of depressive episodes that look really severe, like abnormally severe, and they came out of nowhere. So yeah, I get it. There could be some people who may legitimately have biologically driven depression, but I think most people who know people who are depressed, they identify that there's hardship. And doesn't it just make sense that maybe just giving these people medications to kind of constrict their emotions without actually like helping them overcome their problems could actually make them worse in the long run? That does to me. And in our mental health systems, they're really not set up to support people in the way that they need to be supported.
The chemical imbalance story is just a violation, obviously, of informed consent, because you're told you have something wrong with you, this fixes it, and it's not true.
That's like the most valuable thing that Robert Whitaker brought to psychiatry. He talks about this with ADHD, with depression, with schizophrenia, with bipolar disorder. It is definitely worth a read. Many people describe his book as really being that like red pill moment in the Matrix where they read it and they go, oh my God, this has happened to me, or this has happened to my mother or my sister or someone. And they just, after reading it, they just see this whole kind of cascade of like horror and why they are where they are. So really excellent book. Cannot recommend it more highly.